back to WCB Jazz Vinyl. Today, I want to talk about the upcoming release of Charles Mingus's In Argentina, the Buenos Aires Concerts. This has been put out by Resonance for Record Store Day, which is coming up on April 12th. They were kind enough to send me this copy, which I very much appreciate. And so what I wanted to do is talk about, is this a worthwhile release? Is this something that you should look for on Record Store Day? How does it sound? What do I think? All of those kinds of things. So before we get into it, of course, go ahead and hit like because you can preemptively do that because you know you're going to like the video. And you can hit subscribe. And then if you'd like, you can follow me on Instagram. I'm at what_can_brown. All right, so let's talk about some of the particulars of this album before we get into the music. So again, this is what it looks like. It comes in a tri-fold, so it's a triple disc, and it comes in a tri-fold kind of format, which I think is the probably the only way to do it when you have that many discs. It does come with a 16-page booklet, as is common, I would say. You usually get a booklet of some sort with Resonance releases. As far as the music here, it is a live performance. So it was recorded on two different days. There was June 2nd and 3rd of 1977. The first two full discs of this were recorded at Teatro Coliseo, and the third disc was recorded at Teatro SHA, or Sociedad Empresa Argentino. I don't know if that's how you pronounce that. Mastering of this content was from the original master tapes by Matthew Luthans, and of course it was produced by co-presidents Zev Feldman and George Klaban at Resonance Records. This is one of a couple of records that Resonance is putting out. Each of them are quite impressive. There's another one by Freddie Hubbard and one by Kenny Dorham. So really, I think pretty exciting stuff coming out of Resonance for Record Store Day. All right, so y'all know how I love putting some of this music in context, and I mentioned this booklet, and there's some great context in here. You actually get what is it, like Zev Feldman interviewed Jack Walrath as well as Ricky Ford, who actually were performing at this concert, which I think is super cool that he was able to do that and get with these musicians and get their recollections and put it in this booklet. But I guess a little bit of context maybe to set the stage though. So at this time, what was happening for Charles Mingus, 1977, right? So the liner notes explain that his album 3 or 4 Shades of Blue was put out in 1977, and that was actually his most lucrative album, at least for Atlantic, if not across really all labels. It did a lot better than a lot of his previous albums did. Despite that success, or unfortunately, along with that success, Mingus was also in a bad state of health. He hadn't yet been diagnosed with ALS, which would be about 6 months later, but he was already suffering from the effects of the disease. He had a hard time getting around, and it impacted his mood. The liner notes explain that some of the audience had a hard time actually hearing the bass because he didn't have the right amplification equipment on hand, which I think could have magnified that mood as well. I'll say this though, if the audience at that time couldn't really hear him that well, and he was maybe not necessarily in a bad mood, he sure is audible in the recording, and he sure sounds good in the recording, and I actually didn't perceive really any issue with it. But otherwise, on this tour in 1977, I mean, of course, he was going to be promoting 3 or 4 Shades of Blue in terms of incorporating some of that content into his set list, which he did. So what he did is he played a rendition of Goodbye Pork Pat Hat, which, okay, is not a, it was composed a long time prior. It didn't debut on that album, but it was performed on that album, or it was included as a track on that album. He also includes here Nodding Your Head Blues and the title track 3 or 4 Shades of Blues. So all 3 of those are included on that album, and they actually represent a good amount of the content here because if I didn't say it up front, this is long format tracks. It's not a lot of short little kinds of things. These are more expansive tracks than maybe what you would expect if you haven't heard a Mingus Live album before. Otherwise, in terms of content here, we have Duke Ellington's Sound of Love, which appeared on Changes 2, the album Changes 2 in 1975. We then have the title track from Cumbia and Jazz Fusion, which is interesting because that album hadn't yet been released. And now that I think about it, no, I think it was recorded, but it hadn't yet been released. So he was essentially playing some new content that the audience wouldn't have heard in any other way at that point. Otherwise, in terms of tracks, we have a version of Sue's Changes, probably a reference to Mingus's wife, a rendition of Fables of Faubus, and then For Harry Carney. There's also a couple of other things where Mingus would play almost like intros and outros, which is pretty common. If you've heard the live Mingus box set that Newland Recordings put out, you heard a lot of that, almost like theme song esque, where he would kind of play a short and brief sort of almost introduction or outro. So there's some of that, and then there's also Mingus playing some solo piano. Although when he does, it's fairly short. So at the same time that a lot of the tracks are quite expansive, some of the piano tracks, I think there's two of them, and some of those intro outro stuff is pretty limited. Otherwise, the lineup here on this album In Argentina is the same as on that album, which was Three or Four Shades of Blue. At least in terms of the core lineup from that album, because they actually did kind of swap in and out a few folks. So that album actually included Three or Four Shades of Blue included three guitarists and two additional bassists, although not always simultaneously. So what we have here on In Argentina is more of a classic pared back lineup with more of a classic sound. And in fact, there's no electric instruments here at all. So what is that lineup? You may be wondering. So I referenced about some of the interviews that Zed Feldman completed. So of course, Jack Walrath is here on trumpet. You also have Ricky Ford on tenor. Obviously, Charles Mingus is going to be on bass, and he plays piano on two tracks, like I said. Got Bob Nellums on piano and Danny Richmond on drums. So certainly Danny Richmond is the long timer in terms of playing with Mingus, really at the very beginning as well as at the very end of his career, and was a guy who, despite the fact that I know that they had that they had their disagreements, that they kept coming back together, and it proves that I think it proved over time that it was a fruitful collaboration. So like I mentioned, you don't have electric instruments on this album, and it is just quintet. So the product of that on this album is what I would say is an older sounding sort of concert. And I don't mean old in terms of how the music is performed, but it's not really leaning into 1977. Like when you hear this, especially on some of those songs that we've heard before, Fables of Faubus or Goodbye Pork Pat Pie Hat. Can't even say it. Um, you'll kind of forget. You'll kind of forget that, I guess, that this is 1977 at the tail end of Mingus's career, after he's kind of played all this other, composed all this other music, because it really does sort of take you back to that, because the sound of an acoustic quintet, especially with this group playing Mingus's vision, I think very much leans or looks back to the sounds of, call it the late 50s and into the 60s for Mingus's music. And here's the thing: I love all eras of Mingus, and one of the things that I've continuously said, including I think in some of my videos, is that one of my favorite albums that Mingus ever recorded is Let My Children Hear Music, which I think was put out in 1974. So even though I really do like his sort of large format, bigger band, raucous kind of stuff, like you can hear on Let My Children Hear Music, this is despite the fact that it's the 70s, just sounds a little bit like it's a little bit earlier. It's not necessarily, call it, aware of how crazy some of his compositions would get. So the sound on this is actually and possibly one of the best sounding live performances that I've heard of Charles Mingus. Now, part of that could be because, again, it was late 70s. Maybe there was better recording equipment, more experienced recording, or just the venues did a particularly great job. But what you don't hear, despite the fact that there is an audience, like you definitely hear the audience, you hear them politely applauding at the end of tracks as well as after some solos, you don't really hear very much disruption from the venue, though. And in fact, in many cases, while listening to this album, you'll forget that it's a live performance at all, because the sound is that well done. There's no issues with any individual instrument getting lost in the mix. There's a really great balance all of the musicians sound great. It isn't This is not one of those examples where you have to say, oh well, the soloist sounds great, but everybody else, I don't know, like they're sort of, pushed to the back. That just isn't the case here. This album sounds like it was recorded in order to be released on record, even though it wasn't. And in fact, I don't know why it was originally recorded. Um, I just thought that the sound was that good. All of the instruments sound great. Don't get me wrong. There's one or two areas where Jack Walrath kind of overblows his trumpet, but here's the thing: is that you would have heard that on a studio album that Mingus put out too, because Mingus was all about the energy. He was all about the character of the individual, musicians who were playing, and he would encourage them vocally during his performances live as well as in studio with the Jazz Workshop. He would be encouraging them vocally to, play harder, play faster, put more emotion into it, all of that kind of stuff. And so even though there's a couple of examples here where Jack Walrath kind of overblows on his trumpet, it still doesn't suggest that this wasn't a that it doesn't sound like a studio recording. I just thought that they did really good job. Every musician sounds great. All sound present. They're all audible, and yeah, it's a very clean sounding live recording. And it took me back a little bit, because I think that some of the other Mingus box, some of the both box sets as well as other content that's been put out, hasn't necessarily had consistently great sound quality. It has been a little bit more of, oh, they're putting it out because it's an archival release, and that's supposed to, impress us, and we're supposed to be appreciative, and I always am, of that kind of style. But this doesn't have that. Like, there's no excuses that need to be made for this. This sounds good on its own as an album, as a 3 LP album anyway. And yeah, I was very happy with how it sounds. All right. So long-winded way of me saying yes, sounds good. So as far as the tracks, couple of highlights. And I do enjoy really all of this album, but a few things that I'm going to point out. And one of the reasons why I'm pointing them out is because you can go to Bandcamp and you can preview, I think, a track, and I think you can go to YouTube, or possibly is it Resonance? I forget, but there's places where you can go and actually preview this music, because they're kind of promoting it early, as well as the fact that Resonance, I believe, is putting this out on CD after Record Store Day, so that you can get it on CD if that's the format that you prefer. So one of the tracks, I think it's track 2, is Duke Ellington's "Sound of Love" is what it's called. So Duke Ellington had died in 1974, 3 years prior, and this would seem to be a little bit in honor of him. What I would say about this particular track, despite the fact that everybody sounds good, is that Ricky Ford's sax solo is fantastic. It's like an extended statement, sounds excellent. It's clear that the crowd loved it too. They're like roaring at the end of it. And it's immediately followed by this really soft, sensitive piano solo. And I found what really struck me, I think, is how intimate it sounds, considering the venue and considering what sounds like a fairly large crowd. Overall, I mean, the solo sounds phenomenal, but with the piano, it's amazing that there's an audience at all, because you can't really hear them. Like, there's just no disruption. There's no extraneous room noise. It sounds like the pianist is in a studio playing, and it's just quiet and sensitive. And I was simultaneously impressed by how great the track is and how well the solo sounds. And then it hit me, this is live. Like, that's how good it sounds. So again, I think credit to the musicians, credit to sort of a sensitive audience, as well as the recording quality. So maybe just a couple of other things to point out. Nod in Your Head Blues is a really nice sort of high energy blues number with, again, a really great solo by Ricky Ford. One of the reasons why I wanted to mention this is that I think to some degree, people some people don't like Charles Mingus, and I think that they when they hear the name or they think of his music, they think it's going to be a certain way, and that way is not going to necessarily be the type of jazz that they like to listen to. And while this is not sanitized Charles Mingus by any stretch of the imagination, the fact that it's a 5-piece group, and that they play blues here, what I think you get is something for everyone on this. Like, there's nothing here that's terribly out there. But Nanya Head Blues is definitely the most straight ahead of the tracks here, is a blues number, like I said. and all musicians sound great. It's more of a traditional structure. I just think, I think that even people who are only like sort of casual Mingus fans are going to enjoy all this content, but especially Nanya Head Blues, which is it's almost like an 11-minute piece. Um, so in addition to that, let me mention, so the opening of, or actually the only track on side C is For Harry Carney. And this is another one. So I mentioned that piano solo that didn't really sound like it was live. This is another one that doesn't even sound like it's live. It sounds like it's more in studio. Ricky Ford's tenor solo is a huge highlight. You hear him being encouraged by Mingus, who is known again for shouting at people during their solos. Um, and again, obviously, even though you're going to hear some clapping at the end, it's not distracting. It's clear that it was a polite a polite audience. And I know that I keep talking about Ricky Ford. For me, in a way, it sounds like he's a little bit of a highlight on this entire album. And I don't know if it's because in Mingus's kind of state of health that he was maybe starting to take a little bit more of a back seat and not being out front and center with so much solo space. But here's the thing: at the same time, like on Cumbia and Jazz Fusion, that 22-minute version, which must have been tiring to play. I mean, it is raucous song with like a great consistent bass and piano rhythmic line that I think anchors the piece really well, and the musicians trade solos. Um, I think, like I said, like yes, okay, Ricky Ford takes the front seat, but it just feels like either Mingus wasn't showing that he lacked energy, or he was saving himself on some tracks and then really playing hard on others, because I think he sounds great as well. So I know that I have a tendency to be pretty verbose and talk at length about a lot of these things. And I kind of want to I'm actually going to leave it at that, and maybe leave it with this kind of conclusion that again, it sounds more like a studio recording than a live recording. It doesn't suffer the reputation of what I'll call some other archival releases. Sound quality just really is nice on this. Each of the musicians are present in the mix. It's very well balanced, and like I said up front, I think this is one of the best live Mingus albums that I've heard. And this is coming from somebody who, I mean, don't get me wrong, like I'm not like the Mingus expert, but I'm a big fan of Charles Mingus, and so I was going to lean into this release anyway. I was going to pick this up regardless of whether or independent of them sending me a copy. And I just I thought it was super cool that they included this. This is late 70s Mingus, which there's not that much of, especially because he was like I said, he was diagnosed so soon after, and his health went into decline. So in a way, this is this is right at the end, right, for Charles Mingus, and to be able to hear such an inspired group with him playing live in Argentina, I think is pretty cool. So hopefully some of this discussion was helpful, because I know, listen, we're all having to prioritize how much money we spend, especially on record store day, and especially on this record store day with so many really amazing titles coming out. So hope this was helpful, giving you an idea. And I would definitely encourage you to go and preview some of this stuff. Like I said, you can on Bandcamp. I think you can on YouTube. Head over to Resonance Records website, and you can learn more about when that CD release version is coming out as well. So thanks very much for your attention, and I'll see you next time.